It's that time again. Time for another episode of Shelve It or Shove It, the completely superficial way to pick books for your TBRs based solely on their covers. I am your host, Daisy X Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And this month we're going to mix it up a little bit. We're getting rid of the YA young adult category and going with horror. Now, because Goodreads doesn't have its own horror category on their new month releases, I'm going to the horror category and picking the first 5 books listed on their new releases. And next month I'll do that again, but if it's the same 5 books, I'll go on to the next 5 books in the category. I'll figure it out. I'll figure something out. So let's go ahead and start with horror. Now, once again, I'm picking books for my June TBR. I'm not quite sure when these books are released, at least in science fiction and fantasy. I know they'll be released in May. But going ahead and jumping into horror, the first book is Home is Where the Bodies Are by Geneva Rose. Apparently a New York Times bestselling author. She has a recommendation from Colleen Hoover. And I love this cover because it's a VHS tape, a little bit of blood on it. Because it's a VHS tape, we know right away we're in the 80s or 90s. And I think this is probably going to be a slasher story. And when it comes to horror, I prefer my horror supernatural. And even though I like the cover, because I like the VHS tape, I am not really into slasher stories. And because that's what the cover is telling me, that is why I'm going to have to shove it. Next up is You Know What You Did by K.T. Wynn. If thoughts could kill... ... So, I'm going to think maybe this is some type of psychic, mind-reading, scanners story. And I do like that image of this woman that looks like you're looking at her through water, and it looks like a ladybug. Is that a ladybug or a moth? That could be clearer. I am kind of interested in psychic scanners type stories. Scanners was one of my favorite horror splatter movies from the 80s, but I'm not in love with this cover. I'm not in love with this really dark image, even though I like that it's kind of squiggly with the sort of this lime, yellow-green lettering and this thing that kind of looks like a butterfly or a moth or a ladybug. I don't know. It's just not doing it for me, so I'm going to shove it. Next up is One of Us Knows by Alyssa Cole, another New York Times bestselling author, and it says a thriller. So I'm not sure if this is really going to be a horror, unless it's a slasher, which I'm not fond of. That said, I do like this cover quite a lot. I like this sort of gothic building with this silhouette of, I think it's a woman, and dark storm clouds surround the castle or building, whatever it is. And I just wish this was more obviously a ghost story, because that's what would draw me in. But it says a thriller, so I'm not even sure if this really is the type of horror that I like. So for that reason, I'm going to have to shove it. Next up is Indian Burial Ground by Nick Medina, author of Sisters of the Lost Nation. Haven't read that. There's a little shovel up there, and it looks like a alligator, crocodile, and there's this pattern, reminds me of sort of batik. I don't know. You know, I hope this is a indigenous author writing indigenous stories, because the only one I've read in the horror is the Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Little Indians, which I did not like. This one, it's just not there. It's just not doing it for me. Yeah, I am not drawn into this cover design. I'm going to have to shove it. And finally, in horror, Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. I have not read anything by S.A. Barnes, but the name is familiar to me, which is good. The ultimate haunted house story in space. And I like this illustration a lot. I like the person going through this corridor of a spaceship. It looks spooky. It looks eerie. It looks like something very bad happened. And we love haunted house stories and set in space. You know what that means? I'm going to shelve it. So those were the first 5 horror books I saw in the new release horror. And that means we're now going to move on to science fiction. And the first book is The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley. And I immediately think of Doctor Who. I don't know why. And I am not impressed by this cover. It's actually kind of hard to read, that all these different colors and it's at an angle and split. And that's the only thing I'm looking at is this multicolored font against a space drop. I don't think that's very interesting as a cover. Certainly not telling me anything about the story, so I'm going to shove it. Next up is Lost Ark, Dreaming by Suyi Devi Akingbawa. Apologies if I mispronounce it. There is a recommendation by Flatlo Tavmasdi. I know I'm messing up these names. It's a real fusion of African politics, climate fiction, and mythology in the tongue of poetry and philosophy. Wow, what a recommendation. And I do like this cover a lot. I'm assuming this is African futurism or Afrofuturism, and probably African futurism. And I like these buildings. I like this water. It's giving me a lot of apocalyptic vibes. And I'm not sure if I'm in the mood for an apocalypse story, but the middle building looks like it is whole and the other buildings look like ruins. So it could be solar punk, could be any type of climate science fiction, but I do like this cover, so I'm going to shelve it. Next up is Escape Velocity by Victor Manibo. And I love this cover. I love this spacesuit holding a platter with a martini glass that is smoking and chips, as though this is somebody, a waiter on some space casino. And there is a spaceship reflected in the helmet. It's telling me a lot of interesting things, and I am in for it. Absolutely love this cover. I'm going to shelve it. Next up in science fiction is Loneliness and Company by Charlie Dye Roth. An inventive, timely, and perceptive story, according to Emily Austin. Don't know who that is. Have not heard of this author. Do not like this cover at all. I guess this is a person that's very, very fuzzy. I'm going to say a woman with just 3 primary colors and these little pixel holes throughout. I don't like it. I don't like this cover. It's certainly not telling me much about the story, except maybe it's a Photoshop science fiction story. I don't know. I am going to shove it. And finally, in science fiction, Archangels of Funk by Andrea Hairston. And there's a little blurb by Cherie Renee Thomas. Don't know that author. It's interesting. It definitely has a punk vibe, even though it says funk. And the letters are very anarchic. It reminds me of anarchy and chaos. And I'm not sure what this is about. Could it be cyberpunk? Maybe. There's a woman and there's things going around her. There's a brick wall. She's superimposed a couple of times. Artistically, I think this is an attractive cover, but drawing me in to purchase it just on this cover as a science fiction story, not doing it for me. I think I'm going to have to shove it. Next up is When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, A Curse, A Calling, A Sacrifice. And Veronica Roth, I believe, is known for her YA series Divergent. So this is an adult novel. At least it's in the adult section, so I assume it's an adult novel. And I kind of like this cover. I kind of like this man with this gold sun behind him with the rays. It looks very stylized, and he's holding an orchid, and there's a city behind him. And there's a sword, but it's contemporary. It gives me a contemporary feeling. So I'm very curious about the world building here. And I am curious enough, I'm going to shelve it. Next up is The Honey Witch by Sydney J. Shields. It's colorful, I'll give it that. Are there bees? It says honey. I need to see bees in a beehive. Are they hidden? Well, if you can find a bee, good for you. I like the keyhole, giving very much Secret Gardens, giving me Victorian vibes for some reason, but it's not really drawing me in to pick it up just by the cover. I might read the blurb on this one, but just by the cover, I think I'm going to have to shove it. Next up is Evocation by S.T. Gibson. And it looks like a tarot card, and there's symbols of the elements around it, and it looks like the Hanged Man, only he looks like a vampire. And there's this red hand coming down. So very intriguing. Very, very intriguing. I'm going to say vampire story. I'm not sure of the setting, but I like this artwork. I like this card. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and shelve it. Next up is 5 Broken Blades by Mai Corland. This looks so generic. This is generic fantasy all over the place. There are 5 blades, 5 swords, or it could be knives, and there's little vines going across them. The title is in huge font, and I'm just not excited by this cover at all. So I'm going to shove it. And finally in fantasy, Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel. That author name sounds familiar. Anyway, it's interesting. I guess we're looking at the goddess. I like the stylized artwork. I like the blossoms. Is that a lotus blossom maybe? And it's definitely giving the movement of water around it. And gorgeous artwork. Like this artwork quite a lot. Mythic retelling at its best by R.F. Kuang. And that's one of my favorite authors. At least contemporary authors. I just am not in the mood for retelling. There's just been so many retellings of myths and gods and whatever. And I'm just not in the mood for this type of book, even though I like the cover, so I am going to shove it. Okay, this is interesting. We've shelved 1 horror, 2 science fiction, and 2 fantasy. In horror, we've shelved Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. In science fiction, we shelved Lost Ark Dreaming by Suyi Davies Akinbawa and Escape Velocity by Victor Manibo. In fantasy, we shelved When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, and Evocation by S.T. Gibson. Okay, these are all very interesting covers. I think the weakest for me is in fantasy. I'm going to say no to the fantasy. And in science fiction, I think I prefer Escape Velocity as a cover over Lost Ark Dreaming, and that leaves Escape Velocity and Space or Ghost Station. You know, this is my first month of doing Shelve It or Shove It with horror. I'm going to go with the horror. I'm going to go with Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. So let's go ahead and see what I've gotten myself into. A crew must try to survive on an ancient, abandoned planet in the latest space horror novel from S.A. Barnes, acclaimed author of Dead Silence. I remember the title, Dead Silence. That's how I know the author's name. Space exploration can be lonely and isolating. Psychologist Dr. Ophelia Bray has dedicated her life to the study and prevention of ERS, a space-based condition most famous for a case that resulted in the brutal murders of 29 people. When she's assigned to a small exploration crew, she's eager to make a difference, but as they begin to establish residency on an abandoned planet, it becomes clear that crew is hiding something. While Ophelia focuses on her new role, her crewmates are far more interested in investigating the eerie ancient planet and unraveling the mystery behind the previous colonizers' hasty departure than opening up to her. That is, until their pilot is discovered gruesomely murdered. Is this Ophelia's worst nightmare starting a wave of violence and mental deterioration from ERS, or is it something more sinister? Terrified that history will repeat itself, Ophelia and the crew must work together to figure out what's happening. But trust is hard to come by, and the crew isn't the only one keeping secrets. Okay, this is a science fiction horror with a bit of a mystery, and I am here for it. This sounds really good, really right up my alley, and I can't wait to dive in. But I want to know what books you would have picked based solely on their covers. Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.